Welcome to a panel discussion. This is an experiment for the program review. Krell asked all of us to sit together and start a conversation about our postdoctoral experiences and how the fellowship shaped our choice of postdocs as well as our subsequent career paths. So the process for this is that Krell had very thoughtfully put together a nice list of questions about our career paths, and over the last few weeks all of our panel members have answered them, and so we're going to sort of summarize and find some common themes. And throughout this conversation, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand at any time. The microphones are moving around right now. People are waving their hands saying hello. So feel free. We're not going to do the panel discussion and then ask questions later. At any point, just shoot your hand up and we'll address those. So introductions, I guess. I'm Jaydeep Bardhan. I was on the fellowship from 2002 to 2006. So I remember Bill Conley's presentation of his bifurcation diagram. Which is a while ago now. Yeah, and our remaining panelists are?
Is this on? I'm Carolyn Phillips. I was on the CSGF Fellowship from 2006 to 2011.
And you are now at?
So I am now a data scientist at Capital One. I did my practicum at Sandia National Lab, and I was a staff scientist for some time at Argonne National Laboratory.
Cool, thank you.
I'm Aurora Pribram-Jones. I was in CSGF from 2011 to 2015, and I did my practicum at Sandia also. And I got my PhD at UC Irvine, and now I'm a Lawrence Postdoctoral Fellow at Lawrence Livermore National Lab and a President's Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Berkeley.
Hi, I'm Brandon Wood from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I was in the fellowship from 2003 to 2007, I think. After that, I did initially a postdoc in India through a National Science Foundation program, and then came back and did a postdoc at Livermore, and then became a staff scientist in 2011.
Hi. I'm Mike Rosario. I'm currently an NSF postdoctoral fellow at Brown University, and I was with the fellowship 2011 to 2015. Is that right? So, it was the same cohort. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ashlee Versypt. I'm now an assistant professor at Oklahoma State University. I was in the fellowship in Carolyn's cohort. We started with Jay's last year, so got to see him do his final fellows talk. I did my PhD at Illinois and then a postdoc at MIT, and then directly left there to become an assistant professor.
Thank you. So I realized I hadn't actually said where I am these days. I'm currently a member of the Insights from Data group at GSK, which you may know also as GlaxoSmithKline. That is a relatively new position for me. For the last 5 years, I was at Northeastern University in Boston, first in electrical and computer engineering, and then in mechanical and industrial engineering. And I did my postdoctoral work at Argonne as the Wilkinson Fellow from 2006 to 2008, and then another short stint as an Argonne Scholar in the Bio Division. So between all of us, we cover a wide range of different postdoctoral experiences that include lab fellowships, National Science Foundation fellowships of two varieties, PI-centered, sort of driven fellowships at universities, as well as at the national labs. So one of the questions that fellows have and are interested in directly is, how do you get such, how do you find a postdoc experience? So in your process, what were the most helpful resources in finding it, and how did you actually decide which of those many different kinds of postdoc experiences that you were looking for? You want to start, Ashlee?
Okay, so my situation is a little bit not atypical, but anyway, I did my PhD at Illinois with a PI, and then he moved to MIT before I finished. And I finished at Illinois 2 years later. And then when I was looking for postdocs, I was investigating people across the country who had interests that, or had research that I was interested in. And I was beginning to read lots of their papers and getting ready to contact them. And I asked my boss, like, should I go ahead and start doing this? He said, well, by the way, I have an opening for an industrial partnership that your skills would be very useful for. And we're collaborating with like a dozen other faculty at MIT. And you'd have the ability to come here. And so for me, I think in a postdoc there's three main things. There's a project, there's an institution, and there's a PI. And I think you need to change at least one of those things from your PhD experience, if not all three. So I changed two of those things. And the opportunity to be in a place that had a lot of postdocs and a lot of other faculty I could interact with drove me to make that decision to stay with my same PI, but move institutions and change projects and change sort of my trajectory of what I was working on. So searching, I was looking at lots of different things, but that sort of a unique opportunity that came up for me.
So I actually had a weird way of getting the NSF postdoctoral fellowship. I actually applied for it a year before I was even ready to defend. So I was not academically put together. I didn't have my thesis. And it was a first round for me. It was a practice round. I actually applied for two fellowships, NSF and an institutional fellowship. And I thought it would be a good experience to get feedback. And I actually won one of them. And so I kept in mind when I was applying for these fellowships how long I could defer the fellowship. And for both of them, they were 6 months. And so I always had this plan of applying for it. If I got it, I would accelerate my dissertation and try to finish it as quickly as possible to meet that 6 month mark. And if not, then I'd have another year to go and try a different round of fellowships. Oh, and basically, in terms of resources, it was my PI. My PI was very good at helping me extend my network through her network. And so I was able to meet people to be my postdoc advisor and hear about these fellowships from institutions. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of the actual networking process.
So I would echo that. So my experience was actually partially through this fellowship. I got connected with the national labs. I knew that's kind of what I wanted to do, at least for postdoc. I wasn't 100% sure on beyond postdoc, but I really liked the experience that I had there. And I actually came back for 2 summers. So I did my practicum at Berkeley lab, but I came back for 2 summers at Livermore as well. So I kind of had pre-planned that that's what I wanted to do, and I already knew people there. But I wanted to do something a little bit different in the interim. And so that's, I mentioned I had an NSF fellowship that I just found information about online, basically, and looked for connections that I had through colleagues to put together a proposal for that. And so that was always intended to be sort of a short-term stint, something different, something fun, something interesting. But I actually had my subsequent postdoc at Livermore kind of pre-set up before I ever did that. And I never formally really interviewed, actually, because I already had that connection. So yeah, just echoing what was said, I think networking is absolutely critical. This fellowship, this program, this conference gives a lot of opportunities to do that, particularly through the DOE system, but also even through academia. So.
Yeah, the CSGF actually was a huge resource for me. So the Lawrence Fellowship has a very formal interview process. Like you go, if you get selected as a finalist, you come and give an hour-long seminar that I think the whole lab is invited to. And then there's a panel interview with the selection committee, and then you have about 2 days of interviews with staff scientists and postdocs, but mostly staff scientists. But my other fellowship, the UC President's postdoctoral fellowship, there's no interview process for, but you had to get a mentor to support you at whichever campus you said you wanted to go to. And that was all through my PI. I had never actually met my current mentor before, and our research is very different. So a lot of what I do that the DOE cares about, we both work on formal electronic structure development, but he thinks it's really cool that I do this thing he doesn't know anything about, and he tells people that all the time. But it was kind of hard to arrange that relationship, and the only way I could have done that was through my advisor. But when I found out I was a finalist for the Lawrence Fellowship, 2 alumni from the CSGF program were current fellows, and so I emailed them and I said, "Do you guys have any advice?" And I was a little I knew one of them better than the other one, but it's not like we were really close. Like you have friendships here that you develop that are closer than some of your other contacts. But I mean, both of them sent pages and pages of advice about how to prepare the presentation, what kinds of things you could expect during the interview, all of that stuff. So like my main advice would be to not hesitate to reach out to the network of alumni, because I think it's surprising to a lot of fellows how much alumni actually want to help.
So Jay was the Wilkinson Fellow at Argonne, and I was the Aneezer Rahman Fellow at Argonne. Having a named fellowship is great for your academic freedom, it's a prestigious thing to be granted, and in my case, it completely fell out of my CSGF network. I did a practicum at Sandia National Lab. A new PI at the University of Chicago and Argonne reached out to my practicum advisor to say, "Hey, do you want to come out here?" And he said, "No, but I know a really great grad student." And so I got contacted, and he said, "Hey, would you like to come out and consider working at Argonne?" And I said, "Sure, let's talk." I went out to Argonne and gave a talk, and then he said, "I'm going to put you forward for this named fellowship." And I had a named fellowship. And in my case, I said, "Thank you very much for this fellowship. Can I not show up for a year?" And they said, "No problem." So there's a lot of, your CSGF network is a very powerful thing.
I will echo that. I did my practicum at Argonne in the optimization group with Sven Leifer, and that was the connection when I was coming up on graduation. Sven and I had seen each other at a conference, and he mentioned that there were applications open for the Wilkinson, and so I applied, and I already knew the group and what their interests were and how to present what I wanted to do to them. So there was already kind of a culture match and a values match and a technology language match, to go back to something that Bill had mentioned. Out of all these the applications, I wanted to highlight something that Aurora mentioned, which is that the alumni are thrilled to help with anything you need as you move forward in your careers. Any way that we can offer advice, feedback, if you want to do sort of a video conference and go through your talk, I will certainly be happy to help out, and I know many others will as well. Even if we are older types who kind of like huddle to ourselves at the end of the day at the program review, that doesn't mean we are not totally receptive if you come up to us and ask questions, or if you seek us out via email after the conference. While you were preparing your postdoc application materials, some applications have more or less amounts of writing requirements for a plan, for statement of interests, like overlapping with the institution. What role did preparing that play in your success at finding a postdoctoral position, in learning about what you really wanted to do? Anyone?
I'll start. I think, so the question is, how did we prepare our materials to sort of meet the institution we were trying to find a position at? I'm going to start by reflecting on what I think was one of the worst postdoctoral talks I ever attended. And that was an individual who came in, talked, did not at all know what his audience was. His audience was a group of computer scientists, and he gave an in-depth talk on astrophysics, like the gritty details of astrophysics of what he'd done. And he was applying for a computer science machine learning position. And I looked around the room, and every single person in that room was just like, falling asleep, losing attention. They did not care. So step number one, I think, is always know the audience of the material that you're preparing. If you're preparing a research proposal, what are the big research motivations of the institution? What's the big targets? You can ask whoever is your contact there. Like, they might have internal materials that are fine to redistribute that say, look, these are the big things that our institution is trying to target. Figure out how your research proposal meets that. If you're going to go give a talk, it's not that you need to pretend you did different research than what you did, but figure out what way of slicing your research would matter to this group of people, and give the talk targeted towards your audience.
Yeah, so I don't have cool videos usually, like a lot of people do here. I don't do a lot of computational work for the research that I did in my graduate work, at least. And so a lot of my presentations up until the Lawrence Fellowship, other than what I did here, was about equations. But my Lawrence Fellowship talk, I think I had one equation in the hour-long seminar. And so a lot of that came from advice from the CSGF fellows, the alumni who are like, they will say like, have few equations, it's for a general scientific audience, but they really mean have no equations. Like, they don't mean have few equations. Because both of them were CSGF people, so they also, dealt in equations a lot, right? So, but I think, so I applied to a lot of fellowships because, like, I'm a scholarship kid, that's what I do. It's like part of my life always has been, like, since I was little. So when this season came, I figured out which ones I was gonna graduate in time to apply for, and there are a bunch of different requirements. And so even within the DOE labs, there are very, very different application processes. So for instance, like the Truman Fellowship at Sandia, it's like a 10 or 15 page proposal. It's like a really technical proposal. A lot of the other ones are more narrative and are a lot shorter. I went to prepare the big one first, and then I pared things down. But I think doing that larger one helped me think about, like, what kinds of deliverables would be important to a Department of Energy lab from my research, which is very different than, a lot of the NSF-funded grant proposals that I had helped prepare in grad school. But having that helped me make the narratives be a little bit more targeted toward people who are used to dealing in timelines, deliverables, things like that. The other thing is that there are, you kind of need to think about what you want to do ahead of time if you're applying for fellowships. Because my deal was I was going to apply for fellowships, and if I didn't get any, then I was going to start working like my advisors network more and do academic applications and interviews. So looking that far ahead, right, that's like a year and a half ahead that you have to do that stuff for, because a lot of those you apply a year ahead of time for those fellowships. And that really helped me figure out which pieces of my research I wanted to get completed and presentable, not just completed, but presentable to a wider audience ahead of time, like before my thesis was done. And I think that really helped me kind of tweak my, my plan for finishing up my PhD. But yeah, I liked starting with the more detailed thing first.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much echoing what's already been said. I think communicating to a broad audience is something that this fellowship does teach, but graduate school does not. And basically in grad school you become the world's expert in a very, very narrow field by the time you graduate. And you're trained to teach basically people who know everything in that field what you do. And that's not at all what, particularly the named fellowships, but in general, going throughout your career, this is a huge skill, just being able to talk about what you do in a way that is very general and high level. And I think the fear that I had, and maybe the mistake that I made when I was younger, was I thought that would make me sound stupid if I was too general. And I've realized as my career has progressed, it's exactly the opposite. Being able to contextualize, and this goes along with what was said about know your audience. How do you fit into the bigger picture? I think is a really, really important thing. And a lot of times, institutions are actually looking to invest in an individual as much as a particular skill set. And so they want to be able to see that you can adapt to different circumstances. That's very, very important, especially in the DOE labs. So that's my thoughts on that.
So I just wanted to mention something very general about the grant writing process and the the utility of it, and I'm not gonna get around any of this and just say that grant writing, really good grant writing, is really hard. It's a skill that is to be developed, and it's not just a matter of explaining your science, cutting and pasting from different papers and putting them into a single document. What I've seen from the most successful proposals is a really tight narrative, a really tight nugget of knowledge that is so clear that anyone who is trying to understand what you're doing just gets it. And that's a really difficult thing to craft. And for me, it's a love-hate relationship with grant writing because it is so hard to do that. You do have to grind and put in a lot of effort to make that proposal successful. But for me personally, at the end of it, I do like having this document that I've spent time with that is clear and sort of forms a roadmap and gives me some excitement about what I'm going to do next. And I just wanted to say that it is particularly difficult because often with a postdoc application, you're probably switching systems or doing something slightly different, so you're having to write something that is very clear with very little or no data at all to support that. And so it's hard to seem like, you know, going through this muck of ideas and trying to put them together and string them together and have it come out as this crystal ball, right? That's a very difficult thing, but it is very rewarding. And it really has driven me towards my personal decisions in terms of my career.
So I have two sort of tangential things that are related to the original question. So there's been a lot of discussion about fellowships for postdocs, and particularly those at the labs. But from the academic side, you may be more likely to apply directly to an individual PI. So you're searching usually for people who have interesting work that you're you may be wanting to get into that sort of field or that application, and you're going to be looking for senior people or junior people that have funding to support postdoctoral salaries. So a couple of suggestions now that I'm on the side of having peers who are having postdoc positions or knowing more senior people that have postdoctoral opportunities for people. So talk to people at conferences, look at those advertisement boards. Most of the junior faculty who have positions are going to be plastering all those notice boards at conferences to try to find outstanding postdocs. The cool thing about working with young faculty is that you can really help drive their research. They want you to get a lot done, and you get, if they have startup funds or if they've gotten a grant that allows for postdocs, they're looking for people to start as quickly as possible and to be very self-motivated, and it can help your career also. And then the more senior people may have either chair or other kind of positions that allow them to support postdocs without necessarily having to have a grant at that time, or they may ask you to come on board and recommend some fellowships that you can be applying for, NIH fellowships or NSF or other things like that. So look broadly. I was looking at experts in my field and reading a lot of their papers and starting to, go to their talks at conferences. And generally that process is you send someone an email with your CV and say, hey, I'm really interested in XYZ in your lab, and I'd like to know if you have any postdoc openings in that area. Some will have posted on their website if they have opportunities. Others will just not update their website for a decade. So you have to be proactive on your part about contacting them, but it's generally an email exchange, and they'll say, yes, I've got something and it looks good, or no. But I get emails all the time. I'm like, I don't have a postdoc opening, but thank you for your interest in my work. And I may pass them on to someone I might know that might be a better fit for them. And then sometimes they're out of the blue and they have nothing to do with what I actually do. And I say, you got to look a little bit more on what people actually do. Second point is about preparation of documents and things. So one of the things I really took advantage of during my postdoc was using that time to write those materials for my academic job. And so when you apply for faculty position, you have to have basically a proposal of different projects that you want your group to focus on as you get started. And so they're sort of seed ideas for your first few grants that you write and kind of what you want your reputation to be. And so I mentioned earlier that I had moved into a postdoc position that was more industrial, and it was very much like pharmaceutical manufacturing. And I wanted to move into more physiology and pharmacology type modeling. And so I read a lot and moved into a very different space than where my PI was. I felt like having done my postdoc and PhD with the same person, I needed to do something very different. And so I spent a lot of time reading and going to workshops and different conferences and meeting lots of people in different networks than what my PI had, so that I did that. But having the postdoc, because you can, even if you are working directly on a certain project with a certain PI, you don't have the freedom of a fellowship, you still make the time, because you don't have teaching commitments usually, you don't have as many other service commitments, that you make the time to plan for the future, because a postdoc is a temporary thing. Even if you do multiple of them, or one is 4 years or whatever, they're all temporary. A postdoc is not a full-time post-graduation employment. You are full-time, but you are not long-term in that position. So you have to treat it as a planning for what's next, getting the training you want, getting the new project experience you want, getting something out of it so that you're ready for that. You know, you may not know yet what that transition will look like, but use it as a training period. So that was helpful to have that opportunity to prepare those materials, because if I had tried to apply for an academic position out of grad school, that would not have been good for me.
So I'm familiar with a few groups at labs that are very open to and sometimes do hire staff skipping a postdoc. Do you guys think that's a good idea to look into?
No. So the reason I don't think it's a good idea is that I think there is what it takes to be a successful staff member at a lab is partially being a successful researcher, but it's a lot of other things. And you need your postdoc time to learn what those things are. Because one of the things, for example, that was different between me being a postdoc at the lab versus me being a staff member is, as a postdoc, I was funded. My money was there, I had my project, I was making progress on my project. The moment I became staff, there was a starter fund for me to be living on, but they're like, all right, start applying for those DOE monies to start getting yourself funded. And by the way, this is what you cost. And it's a big bill line. At the bottom line of what you would need to bring in to support yourself, you do not, my opinion, you do not want to step straight out of a PhD experience into trying to cover that bill line of what you cost as staff. You really want that transition period.
I could not agree more. I mean, it depends on the lab. In our lab, it's quite uncommon for somebody to come in directly at the staff level. If they do, it's usually somebody who's been, at least at the associate professor level or something like that. So somebody who already has a very well-established, profile externally. To bring in somebody who postdoced elsewhere, the labs are their own beast, right? I mean, those of you who've done practicums know this. It's different from an academic environment. There are similarities, but there are certainly differences. And knowing that system, exactly what you were saying, knowing that system is absolutely critical. And the hiring committees at the lab know that, right? So they tend to give preference, to people who have come up internally through the ranks. Moving from a different lab is perhaps easier because there's some realization that you know DOE, but I think it's a very good idea to do a DOE postdoc if that's your career trajectory ultimately, to become a staff scientist at DOE lab.
I wanted to add that at Livermore, I don't know if this is true at other labs, but being a the name fellowships are great because you have a lot of freedom, but even as a regular postdoc, you get a quarter of your time paid for by the director's office to work on your own projects. Whatever that is, whether that's trying something new, finishing stuff from grad school, that's amazing. The other thing that I would stress is that all of you from having this are positioned very well for getting a named fellowship. So skipping straight to staff when you could have the freedom to develop these other skills or to try out new research or finish a project you started. I really wanted to work on the things I had started on the side during grad school. But to have that freedom is pretty amazing, and you probably almost certainly underestimate your qualifications because humans are like that. But especially from being in this program, right? You've already got this prestigious position here in the CSGF, and then you're going to do a practicum, so you have more experience in DOE labs. So I would strongly suggest applying for those, even especially if you think you're not qualified. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering, it seems like one of the advantages to starting out as staff is the salary. So what's the discrepancy between like a postdoc, a named postdoc, and the salary?
There's very little difference between the jump between a postdoc salary and a staff salary is not that big. You
But
get paid a lot more as a postdoc at a national lab than you will at academic university. The jump once you become staff is not that big, but what you cost to the lab like triples. And that's what you don't want to be responsible for on the day you show up.
Thanks.
Yeah.
the named postdocs are often, you get paid a lot. Like, you can look on the Lawrence Fellowship website, like at LL&L, and you can see what the salary is for people
It's
coming.
very, very close to the staff salary.
Yeah.
So my first faculty position, my salary was what I made as the Wilkinson Fellow, just to be sort of clear about that. They pay well.
So I had a question about how did your future career goals impact what type of postdoc position you looked for, especially if you're looking, for example, to go into academia and considering a postdoc at a national lab?
I haven't done anything else yet, but I want to teach. So that's why I convinced everybody that I should be able to have 2 postdoc fellowships. One at a national lab and one at UC Berkeley. And my UC Berkeley fellowship is, I really don't get a lot of technical advising from my mentor there, like probably more from Brandon than from him. But he gives me a lot of mentoring about professional development, doing these materials for academic job searches and things like that. And that one comes with a hiring incentive for the UC system. So that's a really nice way to show. It also just demonstrates that I've been thinking about it still, right? Like I get to have my foot in both worlds. But lots of Lawrence Fellows go on to academia, like both Brenda and Amanda, Amanda's in the magazine right now, but they both went to faculty positions right after the Lawrence Fellowship. So I think there's kind of a myth, like people would like warn me like, oh, if you go to a DOE, if you go to a lab fellowship or a lab postdoc, like it's really hard to go back. And I actually haven't seen that demonstrated.
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that because we all do computational science, DOE is very well recognized in computational science, so that gives you a major advantage over some other disciplines where if you go to a national lab, people will say it's sort of a one-way street, and that's well recognized. The other thing is there are differences between postdocs in academia and national labs, and we'll have different perspectives on this, but a lot of times in academia, it's connected to who you work for. That is very important. In a national lab, that doesn't carry as much weight typically. It's more sort of the breadth of projects you work on. And a lot of times postdocs will not be assigned to just a single project. It'll be multiple projects, their team environments. So you make a lot of contacts, you do a lot of networking through the lab system. And so, when it comes time to apply for a faculty position or to move beyond that, it's unclear exactly which of those is more valuable. I mean, to a certain extent, they both have value. But at a national lab, at least speaking from that experience, the postdoc is what you make of it, I would say. There are people who end up just focusing very narrowly, and I think that ends up, in some cases, hurting them. I think those who really take advantage of the opportunities that are there, that try to work on a breadth of projects, typically do very well. And I have many colleagues that have gone on to very high-profile academic positions directly from the lab, and that's actually served them very well. So.
I think there's a lot of things very field specific. So in my particular research area, there's not really anyone at the national labs that works on the same kinds of projects I'm interested in. So that was not a good fit for me. But and also, so I'm in chemical engineering as my home department. There is definitely, if you're like me planning for an academic career, you look at, well, where are the people what is the training of all the people who are currently faculty across the country, and you look at that as the norm, and very few had national lab sort of experiences, and most of them are from a handful of the same 20 universities. And so if you can have some part of your pedigree from one of those 20 universities, you have a much better likelihood of being in the academic system. And so that name recognition was a factor for me that that plays a role in the academic field. So if I was headed for the national lab or headed for industry, that wouldn't have been the same case. But in academia, that's at least in chemical engineering, there's very much a bias towards certain schools.
Yeah. Kelly?
So a lot of you have talked about how breadth in your presentations and applications has helped you a lot, and it's been really cheering to hear about how the CSGF has helped you develop that breadth. For those of us who are still early on in our fellowship, do you have any advice for how we can direct our PhD work to put ourselves in a good position on that front?
I used the freedom of the CSGF to do a bunch of different stuff that had nothing to do with my advisor, and that was awesome. So I advise you all to do it. I had met Jonas that way. I got to work on a project with his undergrad advisor. I went to Australia for 6 weeks. Like, I got a lot of my boss. I got a lot done for him. You have to do stuff that they care about in order to get that freedom still. But having my own travel money, not costing him anything. So if I needed a little bit more, I could ask him for that. That helped me a lot. But I also think that working on those different projects sort of prevented me focusing too much on the very narrow stuff I was doing for my PhD. Being here, you learn to communicate to more people just by talking to everyone, but you still are, getting a PhD is about that really narrow focus. But if you can build in breadth into your PhD by working outside of your advisor's field, it helps your networking, for one, but also a lot of the things that I'm working on now, I started while I was a PhD student.
So I remember my first year in DOE CSGF, I felt like I was this black sheep grad student that DOE CSGF was going to write me any day and kick me out. And that was because I spent some amount of time figuring out what worked. The very first advisor I had, I'm like, this is great. I think this is what I want to do. And 6 months in, I was like, all the things I want and I want to learn and I want to get good in, he has no interest in me developing in those ways. So I think I need to move on. So I found somebody at the University of Michigan whose interests and breadth of techniques and things that she wanted to see her research group become expert in was much more fitting of what I wanted. And when I went into that research group, because of the freedom I had in DOE CSGF, I wasn't just doing her research. I also was like, hey, I think we should be using GPUs. And she was like, yes, let's use GPUs. Go get some, find out, let's do it. And so my whole research group ended up getting into GPUs relatively early in the GPU game, just when people were starting to think, hey, maybe this is going to have some really broad cross-the-field implications. And as a result, when I came out of my PhD, when I would talk about the research I did, people would say, that's nice. Real cute. But when I would talk about the work I was doing with GPUs and how we were utilizing for the research and how we were rewriting our algorithms to go on them, that is more or less why every postdoc offer or fellowship offer that people were, that's why. It was the other thing I did that, because I had the freedom to go pursue something like that, that made me attractive. So I also think that sometimes it's less about the specific research thing, and sometimes it's about the other skills that you can show you have. Can you work with Python? Have you worked with this algorithm? Have you done this? Have you worked with this new technology? That is much more interesting than a lot of, I would say maybe that's more of a DOE national lab kind of assessment, what can you do computationally for me? But I think maybe more at university, it may be a little more, how does your research fit into our research profile? But that to me was what opened up a lot of doors.
If you ever get a chance to look at her stuff on the HUMD and the GPU stuff, it's awesome, by the way. So anyway.
Thank you for the shout out.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something that someone told me when I was a PhD student, which is this is your time to acquire the skills and training that you want. As you progress further in your careers, you're going to have less time, less energy to be able to develop those. And it's still a continual learning process, but really this is your time to foster who you are in terms of your skill set and your interest. And I also really just wanted to briefly mention how important it was for me to be really ambitious in my program of study. That was definitely the most stressful and difficult time of my graduate career, but it's also a time when I learned the most and when I challenged my mental models the most, and really had a fundamental change in the way I thought about my research and opened up a lot of possibilities. So I would say, yeah, it's really important to be ambitious in those types of things, because you have a great support network here that will allow you to test different ideas out and acquire that knowledge.
So with the program of study thing, because, I mean, I just, every semester I'm like, what cool class is happening on campus? Sure, I'll take that. Like Josh Vermis and I got to take a K-12 outreach scientific class that I, if I had to be, very concise in the number of credit hours I took or something like that, or had to pay fees out of pocket or something, then I might not have taken that class. But I had the fellowship and I was able to do that. And it was a great opportunity. And then just keep learning things. And like when I was a grad student, we would go to like all these panels about, what's faculty life like and stuff. And the assistant professor's like, you don't have time to read any books. So if you read all the self-help books now, then you'll be ready, 5 years from now. And so seriously, I read so many academic self-help books like, The Effective Efficient Professor by Phil Wonkat, the Professors as Writers by Robert Boyce, all of these things. I was reading them as a graduate student, as a postdoc. I have zero time to read any of those books now as an assistant professor, but I still can go, oh yeah, that one diagram. I go back, open it up, and those are fantastic resources. So read now, and go to workshops now, and panels, and conferences, and all that stuff. So yeah.
I can't echo the read now enough, and read broadly. If you want to advance your breadth, you have all the time in the world now while you're a graduate student. It starts to get constrained as you're a postdoc. Several of you mentioned it's a term-limited position, and as soon as when you're planning that, you have to also be planning the next step, and as soon as you're in that position, you're spinning up that work. And so that's the process that it's going to be sort of until you find a permanent position. So putting yourself in the strongest, most flexible position that you need. As a graduate student, I certainly got the worst grades of my life taking my program of study classes. I learned that I was not good at a whole lot of things, and that was super valuable, because you know what? Now I know, don't try. Respect the people who are really good at it, because they're really good at it. Easy. Okay, I'm just going to go talk to them about parallelism, because if I roll my own, it's going to be bad and I'm going to be embarrassed.
But just dovetailing on that for a minute, I think one of the things that the program of study did for me is maybe it didn't provide expertise in something else, but it provided fluency of language. And I think that this fellowship is very good for that. If you think about sort of where science is, I mean, maybe this is biased, but where science is heading, it's really the exciting stuff is happening at the interface between disciplines. I mean, basically, I built my career around that. I'm a chemist, I'm a physicist, I'm a materials scientist, I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm sort of all of the above, and I think that's true for many of you. It's many of us, and that really requires speaking different languages. And I think that's one of the biggest problems right now, is that we're all sort of, classically trained in one discipline, and we don't know how to talk to people outside of our discipline. And it's amazing how many opportunities there are, even if you're not an expert in something else, just to be able to talk to those people and bring experts from that field in to work with you. And that is, in many ways, the spirit of this fellowship. And the program of study was perfect for that. And so I learned how to talk to, computer scientists, which was really, really valuable and really scary at first. Later on in my career, I learned how to talk to experimentalists, which was even scarier, but really, really valuable. And like I said, that's essentially become my career now. So.
Also, street cred is awesome. That's very helpful, isn't it? So, program of study. So I'm underrepresented on various axes, and I'm also a chemist who does a lot of physics. And so I get challenged a lot, you know, where people try to explain your research to you when you made it up. So having taken functional analysis as a graduate student chemist, you know, I know math professors that never took functional analysis, right? And so to be able to use some of that language to shut some of those things down without shutting the conversation down is actually a really powerful tool. So like that's on that same communication, you know, tip, but it's very important for some of us to have tools like that in order to not be hampered by other people's expectations. So you can use your program of study to build those kinds of tools. Don't think of them as weapons, but use them as weapons as necessary, right? Like you have to defend yourself sometimes, and I think having the program of study really has allowed me to do that in situations that could have created a very hostile work environment if I hadn't been able to sort of manipulate the situation using those communication tools.
Are there any other questions from the audience? As people look at their career paths, as a graduate student, certainly I had this sort of path in mind that drastically changed every year or so. Have you continued on a path? How have your experiences as a postdoc or through the fellowship impacted your career path in one way or another?
So I obviously have jumped off the academic career path, and I am very, very much enjoying my life and my decision to do so. So if you're thinking about it, it's okay. Think about it. Embrace the thought. It's a good life. But that does not mean that my entire experience in the Computational Science Graduate Fellowship did not prepare me for my current job. It totally did, because being a data scientist, I'm kind of like, it's basically, I'm still a computational scientist. I'm a little more data focused. But I mean, what is computer science? But you know, like what were we doing if it wasn't data? So I'm bringing the same rigor to the way in which we're going to computationally solve a problem. I'm bringing the same, let's go look at the literature and bring in those ideas. We're going to design an experiment in order to try to predict the value. How are we designing it? Are we designing it correctly? Like I feel like how are we gonna use repos and GitHub? How are we gonna document our work? How are we gonna make it reproducible? I'm finding I'm sort of bringing that rigor of approach to my job, and it's absolutely coming out of my preparation as a DOE CSGF.
Cool.
I'm still in the middle of my postdoc, but I think having the extra perspectives and being able to talk to people like Brandon who have a perspective on academic life from the lab side, and people who talk about the lab culture from the academic side, that's helped me think a lot about how I want to work in the future, right? Do I want the, focus on the individual, like this thing that you were talking about with academia, like there's a pedigree problem, right? Where it's like, well, are you from one of the schools that we respect? Did you work with this person? Versus sort of paying attention to the project and the team and how well you worked on that, and figuring out that balance for myself. And so I think that's probably the best benefit I've gotten from the postdoc experience so far, my weird foot in two worlds thing that I'm doing.
Yeah, so I originally, I wasn't actually sure what my original career path was going to be, but I sort of had academia in the back of my mind. And I largely changed my mind because I got involved in some things at Livermore that were just beginning. So I was on the ground floor of some new initiatives that were really exciting, multi-institutional, multi-lab. And so I wanted to see those through. And that was, certainly my involvement in the national labs can be traced directly to this fellowship. And then my staying at the national labs can be traced directly to doing a postdoc at the national labs. So ultimately, I guess there's that chain all the way through. So, yeah, it had a huge impact on me.
So I'm currently on the academic path, but if I'm going to be completely honest with you, it was more of momentum to start. I was basically just putting off the decision, kicking the can down the road, and figuring out when I get to that fork, I'll make the decision about what to do with my skill set and what to do with my life. But actually, maybe a couple months ago, I started putting together the job documents and writing research statements and teaching statements. And I'm going to go on this theme about the importance of writing again, because it was in writing those documents and really making space for those thoughts and making the connections, placing my research in the field, placing my priorities, and training other biologists to be more computational. I actually realized writing those documents and pairing those things that that is the road that I do want to continue going down on. And so it's very hard to, again, make space for trying to figure out what your priorities are professionally, personally. But for me, my tool, I'm just going to keep going back to this, has been the writing. It has made everything very clear to me in terms of my personal priorities.
So, pathway. I am from a rural town, first-generation college student, had no idea what engineering was, but I sort of just picked it. And then when I was a grad student, I was like, oh, I'm going to work for the pharmaceutical industry, because I could see like benefit to humanity in that. And my research advisor and other faculty are like, you've got really great grades, you've been doing research, you should go to grad school, because I would say, oh, I'll go to grad school after some years. Like, that's dumb advice. Just go to grad school now because otherwise I wouldn't want to take the pay cut. So I went to grad school kind of on this whim, and they're like, oh, I really like this. This is working out. I like the research side. I liked the networking. I love going to conferences. I love talking about science, learning about science. But my postdoc allowed me to get more research experience and get more publications out. I felt like that was the part I was shy or limited on from my graduate school experience. I had tons of teaching and outreach and mentoring and like all those other things that, you know, are worth are like 20% of your faculty job, but to me were like 90% important. And so I focused 80% on those on the research side at MIT, and 25% on the Girl Scouts and the other service stuff that I do while I was in Boston. But I got, through the fellowship, I always had, and still do, I put in my grants that, you know, I have this computational science background, and so people don't question my capabilities on the computational side. They make, I'm basically acting as a physiologist now, and I've never taken a physiology class. I just read like crazy and talk to people and ask questions. And now we're publishing on how the kidney functions and various things. And so, great collaborators though. And so just that the computational side, people know, okay, we trust her, she's got that part down. But so the pathway, it's always just like, oh, I'll see what happens. And oh, that's kind of neat. And so, but looking, I personally didn't want to end up at one of those schools that is those pedigree schools. Like, to me, the research pressures are not my priority. Like, I wanted to balance. So at my institution, research is 50% of the appointment, teaching is like 32%, but 32% is still 3 classes per year in my department, which is kind of high for chemical engineering. But I really, really, really wanted to work with the students. And undergraduate research was a huge part of my personal experience, and I wanted a place that valued that. So I was looking at institutions where the things I like to do on outreach and the things I like to do with undergraduate students would be valued, and they wouldn't be, or even just doing good things in the classroom wouldn't be seen as something that diminished my research. There are actually ways I can accelerate my research, and having these undergraduates publish is very well rewarded and compensated. And so I found a university that was a good fit for me and the kinds of things I was interested in. So I think we all have tried to find things that are a good fit for our personal interests and priorities and what we want to do. And it might take multiple positions to try to find those, but we've all been sensitive to thinking about, okay, what do I like and what do I want to do, and kind of following that. So I feel like there is no one definition of success. Like, we all have very different pathways, but hopefully we're all feeling pretty, happy, or at least, challenged by what we're doing, and feel like we're on a good, sound trajectory. So there's no right one way to do a postdoc. If you don't do a postdoc, you want to do something else. Like, there's not a right or wrong pathway. Just choose it and be excited about it. And if you don't like it, choose something else, after a while. So.
Thank you. So we're coming up on the end of this scheduled time. Is there anything that you'd like to share that we haven't covered so far?
Well, I was just going to I guess, chime in on that. Keeping options open is always a good thing. I mean, I think, planning for the future, that's basically what we've been taught to do, is always look for the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. But we're also all in a very rapidly evolving field. And I think seizing those opportunities as they come is really key. And frankly, none of us have any idea what those are going to be in 5 years when you're actually looking for those. So I think flexibility is really, really key. And that's in many ways the theme of this fellowship.
I just want to re-emphasize Ashlee's really good point, which is figure out what works for you. Figure out what you want. I think a lot of times, especially when we come from this academic system, there is this tendency for our culture to try to tell us what we're supposed to want and what's of value, but don't. If you want to go someplace where you can do more service, learn that about yourself. Maybe, like you said, you go someplace that doesn't care at all that you're doing service, and you go, well, then maybe this isn't the place for me. So figure out what your values are, what gets you up in the morning, the kind of life you want to live, and don't just listen to the culture saying, well, why aren't you applying to an R1? That's what is of value.
The fellowship affords us that space to sort of find that, right? It can't give us all the space we need, but it can certainly provide a buffer during your PhD to find that what you want. And then it positions you strongly for finding postdoc experiences afterwards to get a little bit more space. And a lot of people don't have those opportunities, so it's important to take advantage of them. Brandon, Aurora, you were.
I wanted to say about writing, if you can start writing regularly, you will get better at figuring out what your values are. Writing is a way of doing that, and it's really hard to write every day, especially as your time gets more and more compressed, and you're gonna need to write. If you stay on these kinds of technical paths, you're going to need to write more frequently than you have time for, it seems like. But I think using that as a tool for that personal development is really key. It can be really hard to notice how much you've internalized other pressures until you start unpeeling all of that. And I think writing regularly allows you to access parts of your psychology that you don't get to do if you're writing occasionally. So while you're in grad school, try to write every morning or every evening or every something, and just do it. And then you'll be able to use the writing time that's more directed, like these applications, or that becomes more effective. It's the way that you can make that a more effective tool for yourself. I was very fortunate to because of the fellowship, I got to run fellowship writing workshops, and that kept me writing more, and that's really helped me navigate, all of the conflicting messages and priorities that I think every human has. So yeah, using those tools is really crucial.
Yeah, it's shocking to me how much writing we do, and as I progress in my career, it's amazing how many. It's not just papers, right? Proposals, reports. It's constant. There's a never-ending flow of writing that has to be done, and it's interesting being on the other side of this now, where I'm hiring postdocs. And one of the things that I would never have thought of necessarily, or at least I wouldn't have thought was as important as it is when I was applying for postdocs, is writing skills, communication skills. Having somebody who can take that and sort of give me a nucleus of an idea that I can work with is so valuable and incredibly rare, as it turns out, in our fields. And most of us here, all of you really, have that skill, or else you wouldn't be here. I've also been on the screening committee of this fellowship, and it is easy to pick out the people who know how to write from those who don't, and that's an immediate, red line through the name if they can't communicate. So yes, writing, lots and lots of writing.
Communicate your science and engineering as much as possible.
My sister got a degree in creative writing, and I just joke that I write way more than she does, and I will get paid more for every word that I write than she ever will, because she hasn't published anything yet and lives with my parents and works at a library.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's thank our panelists once again.